Picture this. You finally get the promotion. The salary goes up. The title changes. You post about it. People congratulate you. And then Monday morning hits. And you are right back at your desk, earlier than before, staying later than before, skipping lunch, answering messages at 10 p.m., and somewhere in the back of your mind a quiet voice asks, "Is this actually it? Is this what winning looks like?" That voice isn't weakness. That voice might be the most intelligent thing inside you. Because what you are feeling, that strange emptiness underneath the achievement, has a name. And the Romans diagnosed it 2,000 years ago. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The life that modern society calls successful, the packed calendar, the corner office, the back-to-back meetings, the six-figure salary, a Roman aristocrat would not have admired that life. He would have felt sorry for you. Not because you aren't working hard, but because to him, working that hard was the very definition of a wasted existence. Let's start with a word, because language tells you everything about what a civilization actually values. The Latin word otium. Most dictionaries will translate it as leisure or rest. That translation misses almost everything important about it. Otium was not what you do when you collapse on a Friday night after a brutal week. It was not scrolling through your phone in a dark room pretending to decompress. Otium was the Romans' word for the highest possible use of a human life. It meant time spent in genuine thought, reading philosophy, writing something that mattered, sitting with a friend long enough for the conversation to go somewhere real, walking slowly enough to actually notice the world around you. This was not the reward at the end of a Roman's life. This was the entire point of it. Everything else, the court appearances, the political obligations, the business dealings, all of it was considered an interruption of the actual work of being alive. They had a word for that interruption: negotium. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The Romans did not define rest as the opposite of work. They defined work as the opposite of living. Think about how completely different that is from everything you were taught. You were raised to believe that work is the main event and free time is something you justify, something you earn, something you feel vaguely guilty about the moment you start to enjoy it. The Romans had the whole thing inverted. And the longer you sit with that, the harder it is to argue they were wrong. Now, here is where it gets personal, because we need to talk about what a salary actually meant to a Roman thinker. In 2026, a high salary is the scoreboard. If someone tells you they make $300,000 a year at a major tech company, your instinct is probably respect, maybe even envy. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest minds, would have looked at that person with something much closer to pity. In his writings on duty, Cicero makes a blunt and uncomfortable argument about wage labor. He says that the very act of selling your time to another man is a form of servitude, not a metaphor for servitude, actual servitude. It did not matter how large the number on the paycheck was. If someone else owned your hours, you were not free. And to a Roman, freedom was not something you celebrated on a national holiday. It was something you either lived every single day or you didn't have at all. Think about your own morning. Your alarm goes off. Within minutes, you are already reacting. Notifications, messages, a calendar that someone else filled while you were sleeping. You have not had a single thought of your own yet, and already the day belongs to someone else. That is precisely what Cicero meant, not slavery in chains, slavery in a schedule. This was not a fringe philosophical opinion held by a few eccentric thinkers. This was how the Roman elite genuinely organized their sense of self-worth. The distinction they drew was between a man who owned his time and a man who sold it. One was living a complete human life. The other, regardless of his income or his status, was considered to be permanently diminished. Before you dismiss this as the convenient philosophy of a slave-owning class, which it partly was, consider what modern psychology has quietly confirmed on its own. Autonomy, the feeling that you are in genuine control of your own time and choices, consistently ranks among the strongest predictors of human well-being. Not salary, not status, autonomy. When we lose it, we don't just feel inconvenienced, we feel the specific, creeping misery that our culture has rebranded as burnout, as if it were some kind of occupational hazard rather than a signal that something has gone fundamentally wrong. The Romans would not have called it burnout. They would have called it the predictable consequence of living entirely inside negotium. So how did we get here? How did the whole thing flip so completely? It happened in layers over about 1,000 years. Medieval monks elevated manual labor into something spiritually noble. To work was to pray. Idleness stopped being a philosophical ideal and became a moral failure. Then the Protestant Reformation added another layer, teaching that worldly success was a visible sign of divine favor. If you were prospering, God approved of you. If you were resting, you were suspect. Hard work stopped being a means to an end. It became evidence of your fundamental worth as a human being. Then the Industrial Revolution standardized the clock. Time became a unit of production, and once time is money, wasting time feels like burning cash. That guilt you feel on a slow Sunday afternoon, that restless itch that makes you reach for your phone even when you genuinely promised yourself you wouldn't, that is not a character flaw. That is centuries of cultural conditioning running quietly in the background of everything you think and feel. The poet Horace, one of Rome's sharpest observers, had a phrase for what we now celebrate as hustle culture. He called it strenua inertia, vigorous pointlessness, frantic activity that produces nothing that actually matters. He was describing people who were always moving, always optimizing, always performing productivity, and yet somehow never arriving anywhere worth being. He wrote this in the 1st century BC. He might as well have been describing your average Sunday evening spent anxiously preparing for a week you already dread. Now, I want to introduce you to the person who makes this argument impossible to ignore. Seneca. And before you picture a serene philosopher living simply in a quiet room, let me correct that image entirely. Seneca lived the way people today dream of living. He had the kind of wealth that makes your idea of rich look modest. He moved in the highest circles of Roman power his entire adult life. He had access to everything the ancient world considered worth having. And yet the question he returned to obsessively, the one he could not reason his way out of, was why it still felt like time was running through his fingers. Why, with everything, there was never enough of what actually mattered. Think of it this way. Imagine someone today who has the penthouse, the private flights, the calendar full of important meetings with important people. From the outside, that person has won. From the inside, that person lies awake at 2 a.m. wondering where the last decade went. That is Seneca. That is exactly Seneca. And what makes him worth listening to is precisely that he cannot be accused of not trying hard enough or not having enough. He had everything and still arrived at the same conclusion. You cannot accumulate your way out of this feeling. You cannot schedule your way out of it. You have to fundamentally reconsider what you are optimizing for. His short essay on the shortness of life makes one central argument. Life is not actually short. We simply spend most of it on the wrong things. We spend it performing busyness. We spend it preparing to live rather than living. We spend years telling ourselves that the real life begins after the next promotion, after the mortgage is paid off, after the kids leave home, after retirement. And then one day we look up and realize we spent the whole time in the waiting room. So where does this leave the rest of us? Because most of us have real obligations. Mortgages, families, student loans, people who depend on us showing up. We cannot simply opt out of the modern economy because Cicero had strong opinions about wage labour. That is not the point. The point is smaller and more immediate than that. It is about stopping the performance, stopping the habit of wearing exhaustion like it proves something. The hour you spend reading something that genuinely changes how you think is not stolen from your real life. The long dinner where the conversation surprises you is not a guilty indulgence. The Saturday morning where you leave your phone at home and walk somewhere slowly is not wasted time. According to every Roman thinker worth reading, that is the only time that actually counts. Everything else is negotium. Everything else is the interruption. You cannot think clearly if you never stop. You cannot figure out what you actually want if you spend every waking hour responding to what everyone else wants from you. And you cannot build a life that means something if you never slow down long enough to ask what meaning you are actually chasing. At some point, you have to stop, not as a reward, not because you have earned it, but because the examined life, the one Socrates said was the only kind worth living, requires examination. And you cannot examine something that is always moving. That quiet voice that showed up on Monday morning, the one asking whether this is really it, that voice already knows the answer. The question is whether you are willing to stop long enough to listen to it.